She refused his money in the snow and demanded food instead. 15 years later, she'd refuse a courtroom's verdict and demand the truth instead. Some debts aren't paid in cash. Some are paid in silence, in loyalty, in a single leather folder carried through courtroom doors that were never supposed to open. If a courtroom twist like this had you holding your breath, subscribe now. Chapter 1 drops next, where a frozen bridge and a stubborn little girl change everything. Don't miss it. The cold in soul that January didn't just bite, it interrogated. It found every seam in your coat, every crack in your resolve, and asked what exactly you thought you were doing outside at 2 a.m. Kang Yoon-ho wasn't outside by accident. Men in his position rarely were. He'd come to Mapo Bridge to meet a supplier who'd developed a sudden, inconvenient conscience about a shipment. The meeting had ended the way these things usually ended with Yoon-ho, quietly, permanently, and without much drama. What he hadn't expected, walking back toward his car with his coat collar raised against the wind, was the sound of a child trying very hard not to cry and failing with dignity. Beneath the bridge, wedged into the concrete shadow where the wind couldn't quite reach, a girl no older than 9 sat with her arms locked around a smaller boy. She looked up at Yoon-ho with an expression that had no business existing on a face that young, not fear exactly. Assessment. She was doing math. Calculating whether he was a threat, and if so, what her options were, which, judging by the way her body angled itself between him and her brother, numbered exactly 1, fight. "I'm not going to hurt you," Yoon-ho said, which is precisely the sentence every dangerous man in history has used to open a conversation. She didn't move. "We don't need anything." He crouched anyway, close enough to see her brother's lips had gone the color of the concrete around them. He pulled out a folded stack of 1 and held it toward her. She looked at the money like he'd offered her a live snake. "We don't need money," she said. "We need food, real food. Not something you hand a beggar so you can feel like a good person and go home." Yoon-ho, a man who'd once had a business partner removed from a yacht mid-ocean for a rounding error in a shipment manifest, found himself, for possibly the first time in a decade, without a scripted response. Before he could produce one, 2 men rounded the underpass, the opportunistic kind, the sort who preyed on exactly this scene because it looked, from a distance, like an easy transaction. One reached for the girl's arm. Yoon-ho moved before conscious thought caught up with him, and within 10 seconds both men were on the ground, groaning, reconsidering several life choices. It wasn't heroism, it was reflex, wearing heroism's coat. The girl watched the whole thing without flinching, filing it away as one more data point about the strange man in front of her. "You're not a good person," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, delivered the way you'd note the weather. "No," Yoon-ho agreed, "I'm not." Her brother's breathing had gone shallow and wet. Yoon-ho, against every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 30 years, picked the boy up himself and carried him to the car, the girl following 3 steps behind, refusing to let the distance between them close to 2. The hospital did what it could. It wasn't enough. 3 days later, in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad decisions, a doctor delivered the kind of news that arrives without warning and leaves without mercy. Pneumonia, too far advanced, too long untreated. No one had known to look for a dying boy under a bridge. That was rather the point of bridges. The girl didn't cry in front of anyone. Yoon-ho only knew she had because he found her afterward in a stairwell, dry-eyed and furious in the specific way of someone determined not to be caught grieving. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a decision instead. "You're coming home with me." "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said. "Charity is what people do to feel better about themselves. This is a mistake I'm choosing to make on purpose." For the first time, something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face. "That's the most honest thing you've said." Her name, she told him in the car, was Amara. His men, when they heard, assumed poison, blackmail, or a stroke. None of them guessed the truth, that somewhere beneath a bridge, in the middle of arranging a man's disappearance, Kang Yoon-ho had acquired something he had absolutely no idea how to survive. A daughter who would spend the rest of her childhood informing him, in increasingly sophisticated language, that everything he'd built was built wrong. He had no way of knowing it yet, but he'd just made the only deal of his career he'd never be able to walk away from. Amara's first year in the Kang household was less an adoption and more a prolonged standoff, conducted mostly in silence and increasingly pointed dinner table observations. The mansion itself seemed designed to intimidate, Marble floors polished to the point of hostility, art on the walls worth more than most people's homes, staff who moved through rooms like they'd been trained never to be noticed. Amara noticed everything. She cataloged the guards stationed at doors that supposedly led to nothing important. She noticed how conversations stopped when she entered certain rooms. She noticed that her new father's business associates wore very good suits and very nervous smiles. She was 11 when she finally said something about it. "You launder money in the East Wing," she announced over dinner, the way another child might announce a fact about dinosaurs. "The import consulting firm. It doesn't consult on anything. I looked it up." Yoon-ho set down his chopsticks with the particular care of a man buying himself time to think. "That's a very serious accusation for someone who still needs help reaching the top shelf." "I don't need help. I use a step stool. And it's not an accusation, it's an observation. I'm not going to tell anyone." She resumed eating. Yet, that single word did more damage to his composure than any threat a rival boss had ever managed. He responded the way he responded to most things that unsettled him, by throwing resources at it until the discomfort resolved itself. He hired tutors, then better tutors. When she outpaced those, he found professors willing to teach a preteen advanced material for amounts of money that made even his accountants blink. He told himself it was about opportunity. It was, if he was honest with himself late at night, which he rarely was, about something closer to penance, though for what exactly he couldn't have named. By 14, Amara had memorized enough of the Korean legal code to make his lawyers visibly nervous when she sat in on meetings she technically wasn't invited to. She'd stand in doorways, arms crossed, dismantling arguments with the calm precision of someone who'd already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Your business model," she told him one evening, apropos of nothing, while doing homework at his desk instead of her own, "is morally bankrupt. It's also just bad long-term strategy. Empires built on fear collapse the moment the fear does. You should read some history." "I have read history," Yoon-ho said. "That's precisely why I run things the way I do." "Then you read it wrong." He should have been furious. Any of his lieutenants would have paid for that level of insolence with considerably more than a stern look. Instead, he found himself fighting something dangerously close to pride, which he immediately buried, because pride was a liability in a house full of men waiting for weakness. She called him father from the second year onward, though the word carried an edge, less affection than accountability, as if the title itself were a contract she intended to hold him to. It was around this time that Jun-woo entered the household's inner circle in earnest, soft-spoken, unfailingly polite, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and never raised his voice. Yoon-ho trusted him the way he trusted very few people, completely and without examination, which is precisely the kind of trust that rots from the inside without anyone noticing the smell until it's too late. Amara didn't trust him at all. "He agrees with you too much," she told her father once, watching Jun-woo through a cracked office door. "That's called loyalty. That's called strategy. Loyal people disagree with you sometimes. He never does." Yoon-ho dismissed it as adolescent suspicion. He had an empire to run, shipments to move, rivals to manage, and a growing unease he refused to name every time Jun-woo smiled a little too warmly at exactly the right moment. Somewhere in the machinery of that empire, quietly, patiently, over years rather than weeks, Jun-woo had begun rerouting funds through companies with names so boring no one thought to question them. Shell corporations, laundered accounts wearing the disguise of legitimate imports, every transaction engineered to eventually point in one direction. Yoon-ho's. Amara graduated her final tutoring program at 17 with the kind of academic record that should have opened doors to any university in the world. Instead, she made a request that unsettled her father more than any threat ever had. "I want to study abroad," she said. "Somewhere far. Somewhere with real courts and real law, not the version you've bought." He should have refused. He should have kept her close, kept her safe, kept her exactly where he could see her. Instead, for reasons he wouldn't fully understand until 15 years later in a courtroom full of cameras, he said yes. Amara left for the United States 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, carrying 2 suitcases and a silence that Yoon-ho mistook at the time for simple homesickness in reverse. A girl relieved to finally put an ocean between herself and everything she'd grown up watching. He was wrong, though he wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for another decade and a half. What he knew, in the years that followed, came in fragments, a law degree from a university that didn't return his calls when he tried to donate a new library wing, a name that stopped appearing on any registry he had access to, silence where updates used to be. He told himself she was building a life. He told himself this was what he'd wanted for her. He told his men when they asked that his daughter was handling her own affairs, which was true in a way none of them understood. Back in Seoul, the empire had developed a slow leak nobody could locate. It started small, a shipment manifest that didn't reconcile by a few million won, dismissed as a clerical error. Then a partner in Busan who'd once been reliable suddenly wasn't returning calls. Then an audit, requested quietly by a rival syndicate looking to expand into Kang territory, that surfaced financial irregularities so specific, so perfectly documented, that they could only have been planted by someone who understood the business from the inside. Yoon-ho brought the discrepancies to the one man he trusted enough to solve them. "Someone's been sloppy," Jun-woo said, reviewing the documents with the calm, unhurried concern of a doctor delivering test results he already knew the answer to. "I'll handle it quietly. You have enough to worry about." Yoon-ho believed him. That was the tragedy of loyalty built without inspection. It worked exactly as well as the person exploiting it needed it to. Over the following 2 years, the leak became a flood. Shell companies with names like Cheongju Trading Solutions and Hanwoo Import Partners appeared in filings, each one traced, eventually, inevitably, back to accounts bearing Yoon-ho's signature. A signature Jun-woo had spent a decade learning to forge with the patience of a man who'd always intended to use it. Loyal captains who'd once have taken a bullet for their boss began finding reasons to avoid eye contact in hallways. Fear, once Yoon-ho's greatest asset, had started working against him, because fear doesn't distinguish between a boss under siege and a boss who's become the siege itself. It was during this slow unraveling that Amara stopped answering entirely. No call, no email, no explanation. Just an absence that widened by degrees until it became permanent, and a tabloid press that filled the silence the way tabloid presses always do, with cruelty dressed as insight. "Even his daughter couldn't stomach him," read one headline, accompanied by a photo of Yoon-ho looking older than his years, standing outside a courthouse for an unrelated matter, looking every inch the villain the story needed him to be. His men expected him to hunt her down. He'd crossed oceans for men who'd insulted him at parties. Surely he'd move mountains for a daughter who'd vanished without a word. He didn't move at all. "She has the right to leave without being chased," he told the one lieutenant who dared ask. It wasn't resignation. It was the closest thing to respect he knew how to offer, the same respect she'd demanded of him beneath a bridge 15 years earlier, when she'd refused his money and told him exactly what she needed instead. What none of them knew, what wouldn't surface until a courtroom in Seoul filled with cameras and prosecutors already tasting victory, was that Amara hadn't run from her father's world. She'd gone to learn a language sharp enough to dismantle it. Every silent year, every unanswered call had been spent in law libraries, in courtrooms, observing systems her father's version of justice had never touched, building, piece by patient piece, the only kind of weapon capable of surviving what was coming. She'd found the first shell company 2 years into her disappearance, buried in a filing she'd pulled purely out of habit, the same habit that once made her catalog guards at doors that led to nothing. The name meant nothing to anyone else. To her, trained since childhood to notice exactly this kind of boring, deliberate camouflage, it meant everything. She didn't call her father. Calling would have meant explaining, and explaining too early would have meant losing the element that made her useful. Nobody, least of all Jun-woo, expected the vanished daughter to be the one holding the folder that would end him. By the time Seoul prosecutors filed formal charges against Kang Yoon-ho, charges built on evidence so clean it should have raised suspicion in anyone actually looking, Amara had already spent 3 years quietly subpoenaing records across 4 countries, under a name the tabloids had never bothered to track. She wasn't hiding anymore, she was aiming. The morning of the verdict, Seoul's Central District Court filled up 2 hours before doors officially opened. Reporters staked out seats like it was a concert. Rival syndicate members sat in the gallery not bothering to hide their satisfaction, dressed for the occasion like they'd been invited to a funeral they'd personally arranged. Kang Yoon-ho sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him the way it used to. Not physically, but in the way clothes stop fitting a man who spent months absorbing blow after blow with no way to strike back. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor reviewed his notes one final time with the relaxed thoroughness of someone checking a bag he already knew was packed. The manifests were entered into evidence. The laundered accounts meticulously documented. The forged signature, verified by an expert witness who spoke with the flat confidence of a man who'd never once questioned who might have taught Junwoo to forge it so well in the first place. Yoonho's own legal team had run out of angles 2 weeks earlier. His lead attorney, a capable man in ordinary circumstances, had the particular pallor of someone preparing to lose gracefully because losing was the only option left on the table. It was at this exact moment, evidence stacked, verdict all but written, cameras angled for the shot that would define the next news cycle, that the courtroom doors opened. Amara walked in. She wasn't the girl who'd vanished. She moved like someone who'd built an entirely new person in the years since. Sharp suit, sharper posture, a single leather folder held like it weighed considerably more than paper should. The room didn't recognize her immediately. Yoonho did, in the half-second before his mind caught up with his eyes, in the way a body remembers a person before the brain finishes processing the shock. "My daughter," he whispered, and for the first time in 30 years, several reporters in the front row watched Kang Yoonho's composure crack in a way no amount of legal pressure had ever managed. Amara approached the bench with the calm of someone who'd rehearsed this moment more times than she'd ever admit. "Your Honor, I request to enter as co-counsel for the defense. I have new evidence directly relevant to the charges before this court." The prosecution objected. The judge, intrigued despite himself, allowed it, partly procedure, partly the simple human curiosity of wanting to know exactly what was in that folder. What followed over the next 2 hours dismantled the prosecution's case with the patience of someone who'd spent a decade building precisely for this moment. Forensic accountants Amara had retained years in advance testified to discrepancies in the forged signatures too subtle for the original defense team to catch. Bank records from 3 countries, obtained through channels the prosecution hadn't known to close, revealed the true origin of the shell companies. Not Yoonho's signature, but a decade-long pattern traceable to a single familiar name. Junwoo, seated in the gallery as a witness for the prosecution, watched his own architecture collapse in real time. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. How many of us have trusted someone precisely because they never disagreed with us, never pushed back, never raised an uncomfortable truth, and mistaken that silence for loyalty? Junwoo's entire betrayal was built on exactly that blind spot. If you believe real loyalty means telling someone hard truths instead of comfortable lies, drop a comment and let me know. And hit subscribe, because only the Junwoos of the world are afraid of people who ask questions. The prosecutor, sensing the ground shifting beneath a case he'd been certain of an hour earlier, requested a recess. The judge denied it. "We'll finish today," she said, and something in her tone suggested she, too, sensed the room had become far more interesting than anyone had prepared for. Amara set the folder down, opened to a single page, a wire transfer, dated 2 years before the first falsified manifest ever surfaced, sent from an account bearing Junwoo's real name to a shell company he'd assumed no one would ever trace back that far. "This is where it started," she said, loud enough for the cameras, calm enough that it landed like a verdict already delivered. "Not with my father, with him." Junwoo's face, for the first time in 30 years of practiced pleasantness, showed something the room hadn't seen from him before. Panic, unfiltered and entirely real. Junwoo had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of staying calm under pressure. It was, in fact, the exact skill that had made him so valuable to Yoonho, the unshakable, soft-spoken lieutenant who never raised his voice, never showed his hand, never gave anyone a reason to look twice. That skill deserted him entirely the moment Amara's wire transfer appeared on the courtroom's projection screen. "That document is fabricated," he said, rising from his seat before his own attorney could stop him. "Just as the rest of this theater has been. It's notarized in 3 jurisdictions," Amara replied without raising her voice, which somehow made the accusation land harder than if she'd shouted it. "Would you like to explain to the court why your signature appears on a shell company account 2 full years before my father's alleged crimes even began?" The gallery, which had arrived expecting a quiet formality and a predictable ending, had gone utterly silent. the specific silence of several hundred people simultaneously realizing they were watching something that would be replayed on every news channel in the country by evening. The judge called for order. Junwoo didn't sit down. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. And for the first time, the mask of soft-spoken loyalty slipped entirely, revealing something colder underneath, something that had apparently been there the whole time, patiently waiting for an opportunity that had finally, catastrophically, arrived. "You think you've saved him? You've painted a target on both your backs." It was in the years afterward, the moment most frequently replayed in the endless documentaries and news retrospectives that followed the trial, the instant Junwoo lunged toward the bailiff's station, hand closing around a weapon he had no legal right to touch, 30 years of composure detonating in front of live cameras. Yoonho's instincts, honed over 3 decades of exactly this kind of moment, moved before his conscious mind caught up. He was half out of his seat, every muscle prepared to do what he'd always done when someone threatened his own: end it, permanently, with the calm efficiency of a man who'd made this exact decision 100 times before. Amara stepped between them, not toward Junwoo, toward her father. "Not like this," she said, her hand flat against his chest, her voice steady in a way that suggested she'd imagined this exact moment more times than she'd ever admit. "Not anymore." The bailiffs subdued Junwoo within seconds. It wasn't, in the end, much of a struggle, just a desperate man making one final, poorly considered choice in front of the one audience that would ensure it followed him for the rest of his life. But the moment that mattered, the one the cameras caught and replayed for weeks, wasn't Junwoo's arrest. It was Kang Yoon-ho, hands still half raised toward a threat he'd have eliminated without hesitation a year earlier, lowering it instead, not because he'd been overpowered, but because his daughter had asked him to. For the first time in 30 years, he chose her rule over his own instinct. The courtroom took another 20 minutes to fully settle. When it did, the judge, visibly recalibrating an entire day's expectations, called for a formal review of the newly submitted evidence, with clear signals about which direction that review was likely to go. Yoon-ho didn't speak until the recess, alone with Amara in a side room too small for the weight of everything neither of them had said in 15 years. "You built all of this," he said. "Not a question. I built it because you were the only mistake I've ever made on purpose that I refused to let go to waste," she said, echoing, almost word for word, what he'd told her beneath a bridge a lifetime ago. "You said it wasn't charity. It was a decision. This is mine." He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in the years she'd been gone, searching for the frightened girl beneath the bridge in the composed woman standing in front of him, and finding her there still, underneath everything, exactly where she'd always been. "I didn't come back to save your empire," she added, quieter now. "I came back to save you from it." The verdict came 4 days later, though by then it had become something of a formality, the legal equivalent of a coroner confirming what everyone in the room already knew. Kang Yoon-ho was cleared of every charge tied to the falsified manifests and laundered accounts. Junwoo, facing an entirely different set of charges now, sat in a courtroom with far fewer cameras and far less sympathy than he'd once commanded. The empire, however, didn't simply return to what it had been. That was, Amara made clear within hours of the verdict, never on the table. "You're free," she told her father, the two of them sitting in his office for the first time in 15 years, the room somehow smaller than she remembered it, or perhaps she'd simply grown larger than the fear that once filled it. "That doesn't mean you get to go back to exactly what you were before. I built that business over 30 years. You built a fear-based empire that nearly executed an innocent man beneath it," she said. "I just spent 4 years dismantling the case against you. I'm not interested in leaving the rest of it standing." He should have argued. Every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 3 decades told him to argue, to remind her whose name was on the deed, whose decisions had built the house she was currently sitting in. Instead, he found himself doing something he'd done perhaps twice before in his adult life, listening, actually listening, to someone telling him he was wrong. Over the following months, the transformation happened in pieces, each one smaller and more mundane than the courtroom drama that had preceded it, which is generally how real change actually works, not in a single cinematic gesture, but in a series of decisions nobody outside the family ever saw. Shipping routes once used to move product no one wanted traced were quietly redirected into legitimate logistics contracts. Front companies that had spent years laundering money became awkwardly at first and then with genuine purpose, actual businesses, employing people who had no idea the payroll they depended on had once existed purely as camouflage. The captains who'd avoided Yunho's eyes in hallways during the trial found themselves facing a different kind of test entirely, whether they could survive in an organization that no longer ran on fear. Some couldn't. They left, or were encouraged to, with severance packages generous enough to buy their silence without the threats that would once have accompanied it. Others stayed, discovering, some with visible discomfort, that loyalty built on respect required considerably more effort than loyalty built on intimidation, and produced, against every instinct Yunho had spent decades trusting, considerably better results. Amara didn't take a role in the new organization. She insisted on that point with the same stubbornness she'd once used to refuse a stack of one beneath a bridge. "This isn't mine to run," she told him. "It's yours to fix. I'll help you build the structure. I won't be the one holding it up." What she did take was the foundation, the community trust established with the proceeds of the Empire's legitimate conversion, funding shelters and legal aid clinics across Seoul, all of it deliberately built without the Kang name attached to a single building or program. "People should trust the work," she said when a reporter asked why, "not the name that paid for it." The press, for their part, struggled to know what to do with a story that refused to fit the shape they'd spent 15 years building for it. Seoul's Shadow King didn't have an obvious next chapter for a man who now spent his Tuesdays reviewing grant applications for a legal aid clinic instead of shipment manifests for product that didn't exist. Some columnists tried cynicism. Surely this was reputation management. Surely there was an angle. Most, eventually, simply stopped trying to explain it and let the shelters, the clinics, and the employment numbers speak for themselves. Yunho, for his part, found the adjustment harder than any hostile takeover he'd ever survived. Power built on fear had, at least, been simple. Power rebuilt on accountability required him to sit through meetings where people disagreed with him and weren't punished for it. A novelty that took considerably longer to stop feeling like a threat. "You get easier to work with every month," Amara told him one evening, reviewing quarterly reports at his desk the way she once had as a teenager, minus the accusation that had colored every conversation back then. "I had a very demanding teacher," he said. For the first time in either of their memories, he meant it as a compliment, and she took it as one. Winter returned to Seoul the way it always did, without apology, without warning, cracking concrete and testing coats exactly as it had 15 years earlier. Mapo Bridge looked the same as it always had. Gray, unremarkable, the kind of place people walked past without a second glance, which was of course exactly why it had once hidden a girl and her brother so completely from a city that should have found them sooner. Kang Yunho stood beneath it now, older, coat collar raised against a wind that felt less hostile than it once had, or perhaps he'd simply stopped needing it to be an enemy. Beside him, Amara set down a box of food, the way they'd done every winter since the trial, a small ritual that had started as her insistence and become